plants might be way smarter than we think. What if trees are actually talking to each other right now? And what if, just like you, me, and the baby cows, plants can actually feel pain? I know, it sounds crazy, right? But modern science is showing that plants are way more aware than we ever gave them credit for. In this video, we're diving deep into the wild world of plant intelligence, covering everything from their ability to learn, communicate, recognize relatives, count, and even see, to the unsettling idea that plants might actually be conscious. By the end of this video, I guarantee you that you're never going to look at plants the same way again. First up, we've got plant signaling, which is essentially the nervous system without a brain. So for centuries, humans have been sleepwalking through reality, blind to the true nature of plants. Now, certain cultures, animist cultures and such, did believe that plants were conscious. But you and I have been taught that they are passive, inanimate objects. That, my friends, is a lie. And today we're going to expose that lie and reveal the shocking truth. Plants are not just alive, they are aware, communicating, sensing, responding in ways that will literally blow your mind. Think about this for a second. Plants have their own internal communication network, which is a complex web of signals that crisscross their entire bodies. Plants use electrical signals, just like our nervous system, but just without a centralized brain, sort of similar to an octopus. And these signals, called action potentials, zip through their tissues, coordinating growth, defense, and responses to their environment. For example, the Mimosa pudica, which is a very sensitive plant, when you touch it, it folds up its leaves. But that's not actually a simple reflex. So for example, researchers took this plant and they dropped it. At first, it closed up its leaves. As in, it sensed that there was danger and it closed up its leaves. Eventually, the researchers did it enough times that the plant realized there was no danger from being dropped and it stopped responding in that way. So that's not just a reflex. That's an example of plants learning to a stimulus that it's not dangerous and that it doesn't need to respond in the same way. And this stimulus is generated by these electrical signals in the same way, you burning your hand sends electrical signals through your brain that make you realize, oh, that's painful, let me take my hand away. Quite literally, it is a parallel system. And get this, even your average pumpkin is sending messages. Action potentials are coursing through its body, carrying vital information that help it protect itself and also, pass on information to the next generation. So when a plant gets attacked in nature, it doesn't just sit there and take it like we might imagine. It actually fights back. For example, when a leaf gets wounded, it sends out an SOS, which is basically a electrochemical signal that spreads like wildfire through the plant. And it releases glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter used in our brains, triggers a wave of calcium ions that activates defensive genes in the leaves, sometimes within moments. This is the plant version of a nervous system and having a nervous response. One of the most remarkable things is the way this universal language plays out. So for example, take broccoli. Everybody loves broccoli as a health food because it has this compound called sulforaphane. Now, very interestingly, sulforaphane is something that is created, manufactured on demand when the broccoli plant is thinking that it's being, eaten. If you cut the leaf or you have an animal eating the broccoli leaf, it essentially releases the precursor compounds and brings them together and forms sulforaphane. Sulforaphane is very reactive, and so it can interact with a lot of proteins. We don't exactly understand what it does in broccoli, but we do know that sulforaphane in us upregulates longevity pathways because it's very reactive and can interact with a lot of different types of proteins. This is a very interesting thing where a health compound that we love is also something that is produced by the plant as a health compound. Now, there's some really remarkable science regarding how plants respond to predation. There's a type of plant that when a certain bug comes and begins eating it, the plant actually releases a compound that attracts that bug's predator. So it then brings in the predators to come kill that bug, which is totally insane. But the communication doesn't stop there. Plants also use chemical and hormonal signals, essentially a complex language of whispers and shouts, auxins, ethylene, jasminates, essentially plant hormones that coordinate growth and response, similar to hormones in your body. But plants aren't just talking to themselves within their own body, they actually talk to each other. One of the ways that plants communicate with each other is that they will send out volatile chemicals into the air that warn their neighbors of danger. So it's essentially like this plant neighborhood watch, keeping the community safe. Plants also have this underground network, which is essentially the wood wide web, which is this vast network of fungi that connects the roots of different plants, called the mycelium network, and it allows them to send signals, trade nutrients, do all sorts of other things. One of the most interesting things is that certain types of noxious stimuli are introduced into an environment, poisons or whatever. Plants can identify that there's a poison, stimulate a response that defends from the poison, and then this is the craziest part. Many years can pass. All the original plants plants can be dead except for a certain few, like the elder plants, essentially. And if this poison is reintroduced, the old plants will send signal to the next generation of plants, tell them to upregulate the same defense response that they learned to defend against the poison. So essentially there's an intergenerational transfer of knowledge happening that plants do. This is this whole hidden world, beneath our feet and actually like before our eyes that we're completely unaware of. Another really remarkable aspect of this generational or familial aspect of plants is that in nature, there's many different plants in an ecosystem. With certain types of environmental issues, plants will share nutrients with other plants. But in general, plants will share more nutrients with their own offspring than they will with a neighboring plant that's of a different species. So essentially there's this preference, like as if they are almost like people being like, oh, well, I'm gonna help my family members first before I help this random stranger. But then, you also will help the random stranger. So it's really remarkable the way plants communicate intergenerationally in interspecies way, and the way they use this mycelium network to communicate in ways that we really are having a hard time fathoming as normal people. Even the plant intelligence scientists are actually facing a lot of resistance from the scientific community because this is so mind-blowing and also poses some serious moral and ethical issues. If plants are conscious, can feel pain, can transfer knowledge intergenerationally, where does that leave the vegans? Chapter 2, plant intelligence. Are plants adaptive problem solvers? We've established that plants are talking to each other, but are they actually thinking? Are they intelligent? Let's break it down for a second. Intelligence is not about having a brain. We know that there are certain types of organisms that have behavior and problem solving and intelligence that are pre-neuronal. So essentially, intelligence is about solving problems, and plants are master problem solvers. They're constantly adapting to their environment, finding light, seeking nutrients, producing defensive reactions, vary depending on the situation, and avoiding danger. For example, a climbing plant can actually sense a support and wrap its tendrils around it. If you move the support, the plant readjusts, actively seeking out the support again. That's not just a random instinct, that's actually problem solving. We said at the beginning that plants can see. That's a pretty bold statement. There's actually very good evidence behind it. There's an interesting plant in, I believe, the jungles of Brazil. This plant essentially mimics the host plant that it's growing on. So imagine, ivy wrapping around a tree, and the tree has a certain type of leaf. This plant grows around this tree and will grow a leaf that looks exactly the same. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, well, there must be a chemical signal indicating that it's that type of tree. One of the most mind-blowing things I've ever heard. Researchers did an experiment because there's typically only around 3 trees or 3 host plants that this other plant grows around and mimics in nature. So they took a plastic plant that is not like anything that this plant encounters in nature, had it grow around it, and the most mind-blowing part, this plant grew to mimic the leaves of the plastic plant that was producing no chemical signals. How is that possible? There is a potential that plants can see to some extent. Leaves in general have a layer of cells that are clear and that are curved, project light in a similar way to the lens of an eye. Now, the crazy thing about this is that leaves in general are for, at least the way we think about it, are for photosynthesis. There's no evolutionary reason why having these additional clear layers of cells that focus the light as a lens does enhances photosynthesis. In fact, it actually detracts from photosynthesis. But the reality is there must be a reason that plants have leaves that essentially focus light like a lens. And this plant that grows and mimics synthetic thing and creates leaves that look very similar to it is one of the best evidence points that we have discovered that plants actually can see. And plant roots, they are essentially little tiny explorers, navigating the complex soil environments, foraging for richer pockets of nutrients and water, while steering clear of obstacles or toxic zones. We know that plants are conscious because when there is a crossroad of decisions that have different cost benefit, we can see that they make decisions not always according to an equation or something like that. They are literally making decisions and deciding how I'm going to devote the resources. It's not just like this random knee-jerk stimulus like when you have your knee hit at the doctor or whatever. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. There's good evidence that plants can actually learn and that they can actually make associations between different stimuli. For example, there was a researcher who dropped the Mimosa pudica plant, and at first, this plant folds its leaves in defense, but after a while it stopped. It learned that the dropping was not a threat and remembered that over time. And it actually retained that memory for weeks while it was not being dropped. That is clear evidence, not of a simple reflex, but of learning and memory in action. It actually gets even crazier. For example, pea plants can learn to associate a neutral cue, blowing of a fan, with a vital resource like light. Researchers actually had a fan blow on these things, and they turned a light on over and over again and conditioned this plant to grow towards the fan alone without the light being present. So essentially the pea plant learned to expect that where the fan was, there would be light. And that's what we call associative learning, which is actually the same kind of learning that Pavlov demonstrated with his dogs. So the Venus flytrap closes when 2 of its sensory hairs are touched, and it closes within about 30 seconds. It's not exactly 30 seconds, it's not the plant parts like 30 seconds to close. It essentially counts and makes a decision based on multiple inputs that will then close. So that is not just instinct. Researchers believe that that's a form of plant intelligence. Now, one of the most fascinating things is that ancient wisdom has told us this for a long time. Before you think this is some like new age hippie stuff, there's actually some historical context for seeing this. It's not like humans living amongst plants forever never realized that plants were intelligent. There's a lot of indigenous cultures that have known and explored the concept that plants are intelligent since time immemorial. See plants as, conscious beings with whom they can communicate and potentially even build relationships. Early scientists like Charles Darwin were also actually into this concept as well. There's a guy named Jagadish Chandra Bose, and Bose was a pioneer in plant electrophysiology. And he demonstrated that plants generate electrical signals, even suggested that they have a nervous mechanism comparable to animals. Charles Darwin, in his book, The Power of Movement in Plants, Darwin proposed this root-brain hypothesis. The root tip of a plant acts like a brain and receives sensory information and directs the plant's movements. Both these guys were keen observationalists and way ahead of their time, because now this is just fledgling science that, as I said, is actually getting a lot of pushback from established scientists and botanists. That said, it's a very similar thing to Copernicus explaining that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, having all of the conventional scientists be like, you are a total idiot, what are you talking about? Or much worse, actually. But chapter 4 is about the modern research that is pushing the boundaries of our understanding of plant consciousness. Nowadays, we've got a whole new generation of scientists who are exploring this idea of plant consciousness. One of the most well-established is a guy named Stefano Mancuso, who is the poet-philosopher of plant intelligence. And he's leading this charge, exploring the complex ways that plants can sense, communicate, and interact with their environment. For example, his team has shown how bean plants can remember the location of a support stick and even anticipate where its position will be. And they've drawn some interesting parallels between root networks and computer networks, actually. This guy's research suggests that plants might exhibit a form of swarm intelligence, which is truly mind-blowing and fascinating. One of the most interesting and hard to explain aspects, until you sort of realize that plants do have some degree of consciousness, that anesthetics, the same thing that will knock you out if you go get your wisdom teeth taken out, those same anesthetics also knock plants out, and these plants will become unresponsive to stimuli for a period of time, in the same way that you do. This also suggests that plants probably have some form of consciousness, which isn't exactly like ours, but is consciousness. It might be a distributed consciousness that's spread throughout their bodies rather than centralized in a brain or central nervous system. It also may play out on different timescales than bacterial or animal life typically does. All this evidence en masse challenges our definition of consciousness in profound ways and raises real questions and moral problems about awareness and plants and how we should treat them. So that's why chapter 5 is about the ethical and ecological ramifications of this awakening. This new understanding of plants is not just a scientific revolution, it's actually an ethical awakening. Plants are sentient beings. Do they deserve moral consideration? We think of animals as deserving moral consideration, right? For example, the Swiss government, in a landmark report, acknowledged the dignity of plants, recognized their inherent worth, argued against arbitrary harm of plants. So that's actually a huge step and forces us to rethink our relationship with the natural world. I think it's time that we move away from this anthropocentric worldview where humans are the center of everything, and we embrace this ecocentric perspective where all life has inherent value, is likely conscious to some degree, whether it's observable by us immediately, like when you see 2 dogs playing, or whether it's something that actually takes studies to uncover, like plant consciousness. Recognizing plant intelligence underscores the importance of biodiversity and keeping our ecosystems whole, undestroyed. If we appreciate that each tree, flower, even potentially blade of grass is a sentient being contributing to this collective health of the ecosystem, it should give us pause before we think twice about destroying them, thinking that we can just freely eat them and that they don't feel any pain. I won't riff on that too much, but chapter 6 is about the theoretical frameworks around all this. How do we actually know any of this is true? What's the actual evidence beyond what we've discussed here? It turns out that scientists in this field are conducting a lot of mind-blowing experiments every year. We're using high-tech recordings to map the electrical signals in plants, revealing for the first time the intricate communication networks that underlie these behaviors that we can observe, some of which do take place over a longer scale of time than you would just see from, looking at it with your own eyes. These scientists in these experiments are uncovering how plants actually learn and remember, how they truly are making decisions, how they communicate with each other, how they pass on knowledge intergenerationally, and even as we explored, how they might literally see. These scientists are exploring the depths of plant sentience, and they're using anesthetics, advanced technology, and other tools to probe the limits of plants' awareness. But we're not just collecting data, we're also developing theoretical frameworks to explain how this is all possible. Researchers are drawing on concepts from neuroscience, cognitive science, and actually even philosophy to understand plant intelligence and the implications of it. One of the more fascinating aspects is this idea of embodied cognition. Scientists are using a concept called information theory to quantify how much information plants gather, store, and act upon. And we're trying to apply these, frameworks around understanding consciousness, something called integrated information theory, which explores vast and strange implications of plants being conscious. Remarkably, there is actually evidence that carnivorous plants like the Venus flytrap can count. In general, in nature, plant doesn't immediately close shut the second, an insect lands on it and touches one of its inner hairs. It actually counts and essentially determines the number of touches before having certain responses. So researchers transmitted an electrical signal to these hairs to essentially trick a plant into thinking an insect was interacting with it. Remarkably, the first touch readies the plant's closing mechanism. Each subsequent touch does something different, such that the third touch, it snaps shut instantly. The fourth touch on one of these hairs activates essentially digestive enzymes. On the fourth touch, the plant produces a type of hormone that basically gets it ready to eat. And then on the fifth touch, the plant actually begins to produce these digestive enzymes to break down the insect. Essentially, these carnivorous plants are counting the number of touches. It activates different responses depending on how many times that these little inner hairs are touched. A lot of these things are very challenging to our understanding of the world. It's very easy to say, oh, well, they don't have a brain. How could they possibly feel pain? We are observing things that suggest that maybe the language that we are using is too limited to describe these phenomena. Expand your mind and understand that almost all new scientific discoveries, in fact, all new scientific discoveries, heavily contested when they are truly groundbreaking, like the concept of the Earth not being the center of the universe, plants being conscious. They're always met with fierce defiance from who are the established scientists. See this pattern playing out, and you can observe that there is enough evidence that plants are conscious that it's almost ridiculous to deny that there is some form of distributed consciousness going on here. And, take that as you will.